Today's essential question is, how do you classify rational numbers? A rational number is a number that can be written as a divided by b, so as a fraction. Where a and b are integers, b cannot be 0. So remember in the last module when we found out that dividing by 0 is undefined. So you can't divide by 0, so denominator cannot be 0. Decimals, fractions, mixed numbers, and integers are all considered rational numbers. You can demonstrate a number is rational by writing it as a over b, as a fraction. So for instance, I have 14, which is a whole number. Whole numbers are 0, 1, 2, 3, and so on. So basically how you would count, but also including 0. So if I write 14 over 1, right, now that's a fraction. Anytime we want to write a fraction from a whole number, we're going to put it over 1. Now in B, we have a decimal. Okay, we read this as 83 hundredths. If we are looking at decimal place values, the first we have tenths, then we have hundredths, and then we have thousandths, and so on and so forth. Okay, so when we write the decimal as a fraction, we usually try to simplify it, and we'll be practicing that throughout this module, simplifying. Now in C, we have what's called a mixed number. We can change a mixed number to an improper fraction, and to remind us how we get 41/8, we're going to do 8 times 5, which is 40, and add the 1. So 41/8 is the fraction. And we'll also be doing that as well in this module when we're multiplying and dividing with mixed numbers. So this diagram is going to show us the relationship between all these sets of numbers. In the outermost circle, we see rational numbers. Okay, and then inside there, we have integers. Now, just a reminder about integers. Integers are the negatives and the positives whole numbers, including 0, right? 0 is a whole number. So positives and negatives, okay? So then inside there, we have our whole numbers. And that makes sense because whole numbers are 0, 1, 2, 3, and so on and so forth. So whole numbers are considered integers, and they're also considered rational numbers. Okay? Integers are not whole, but they are rational. Okay? So when we're classifying rational numbers, we need to think about, is it a whole number? Is it an integer? Is it a rational number? If it's a whole number, it's also an integer and a rational. Okay? Numbers that are only rational numbers are numbers that are not integers and not whole numbers. Okay? So we're going to practice classifying as well. Okay, write each rational number in the form a over b, so as a fraction, where a and b are integers. Then circle the name of each set to which it belongs. So if we want to write negative 12 as a rational number, we know that we could put that over 1. Now, negative 12 is considered an integer, and then if it's an integer, it would also be a rational number. It is not a whole number because remember, whole numbers start with 0, okay? And so on and so forth. Okay, so 7.3, okay? I can write that as a fraction. I can say 7 3/10. And then I can say, okay, 7 times 10 is 70, plus 3 would be 73/10. Now, 73/10 is not a whole number. It is not an integer. It would only be a rational number. So I can write it as a fraction, but it's not a whole number or integer. All right, we've got the decimal 41 hundredths, and that's exactly how I would write it using my place value. I can't simplify 41 hundredths. Okay, it is not a whole number. It is not an integer. It would only be rational. Okay. All right, 6, we can write it as 6 over 1, and that is actually a whole number. Now, remember, if it's a whole number, it's also going to be an integer and a rational because we wrote it as a fraction. And then last one, number 5, I can write that as a fraction. 3 times 2 is 6, plus 1 would be 7 halves, 7 over 2. It is not whole. It is not an integer. It is only a rational. So when we're considering those categories, all right, and this is exactly what you're going to be doing on your assignment today as well. Okay, on these problems, we're just looking at which number set or sets, okay, so it can belong to more than one as we saw before. All right, does it belong? All right, so this is 75 hundredths, okay? It's not a whole, it's not an integer, it would only be a rational number, okay? Negative 18, well, that's an integer. And I could also write it as a fraction, right? So that would be a rational. It is not a whole number because a whole number has to start 0, 1, 2, 3. All right, 1/3, not a whole number. It's not an integer, so that one would be only a rational number. And lastly, we have 37. 37 is a whole number, so then it's also an integer. Doesn't have to be negative to be an integer, right? Because the whole number line includes the positives and the negatives. Also be a rational. So when you have a whole number, it's actually in all 3 categories, right? If it's just rational, it's there. If it's an integer, it can be integer and rational. All right, so keep that in mind. Okay, you're going to practice now some classifying rational numbers, just like we were doing in the video, and submit your worksheet in Canvas.